Well, it's 11 o'clock now, so I would like to formally start today's webinar. Welcome to our participants. It's lovely to have you here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kate Charters, and I'm the chair of the National Steering Committee for SEGRA. SEGRA stands for Sustainable Economic Growth for Regional Australia. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the custodians of the land upon which we gather and across Australia, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. SEGRA was set up 25 years ago now, and the purpose of SEGRA was to provide a voice for regional Australia and to ensure that the issues that affected regional, rural and remote Australia were kept on the national agenda, and that we gave a voice to the people who live, work and invest in regional Australia. We try very much to be a network and to give people the opportunities to meet primarily at our national conference, which will be in Devonport in September this year, but also through our webinars and masterclasses that we run. We have a newsletter that goes out once a month, and you can subscribe on our website for that. But we also put out through SEGRA LinkedIn lots of relevant articles, success stories, new research and commentary on issues that are affecting regional, rural and remote Australia. And so I would really encourage you to sign up for those opportunities if you haven't already. I'm delighted to welcome members of the steering committee to today's session. We have Shani from WA, and Shani is the CEO of Broome Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and we have Rod McDonald, and he has been representing Victoria, those recently moved to Tasmania. Very strong background in business and local government, and particularly involved in the issues of connectivity. And then we have Rolf here, and Rolf Gerritsen is a professor at Charles Darwin University, and many of you will know him as he has been a prodigious author in the subject of regional Australia, and we're very privileged to have Rolf on our National Steering Committee, a relatively new member, so welcome. And I'm hoping that Simon Bowie from Tasmania will be joining us shortly, and Ashley Bland. But I do have apologies from Jen Cleary, who's from South Australia, and Jody Sampson. And Jody is an Indigenous man and brings a lot to the SEGRA community because of his work all over remote and regional communities in the space. So it's good to have Jody on our committee. Because there are a large number of participants in today's conference, it's going to be difficult for people to speak, but I am hoping to invite a couple of people who've got some a particular breaking news to speak. And but please use the chat box to communicate with one another during the session. Some of the material that we're presenting today was in the communique that we issued after the SEGRA 2021 conference, where we tried to bring together all the topics that were discussed and the ideas that were generated there. We had a big ideas board where people put up lots of things, and that's in our communique, which is on the website, or you can email me, and I'll forward you a copy of the communique. But we're trying to take the discussion a little bit further today, and not restricting it to the themes and action agendas of the conference. And we're looking forward as well a bit towards the themes and action agendas for this year's conference. I might throw to Rod first. And Rod is speaking on economic development in regional Australia, and particularly about internet access and models around social investment and social enterprise. One of the things that we won't be talking about but is important is infrastructure. And those of you who are on LinkedIn will have noticed that there have been 2 significant reports on regional infrastructure. And I'd like to direct you to those 2 documents through LinkedIn that look at where the national agenda sits on infrastructure. But as those of you who were hearing the steering committee's discussions before we got started, connectivity and internet access is of vital importance to regional Australia and frequently in the news. And over to Rod to talk a bit about that. Thank you, Rod.
Okay, thanks, Kate. Welcome everybody today. I think there's some good topics for us to run through. I'm looking at 3 things particularly today around the improved internet access, or the need for improved internet access, and some of the issues surrounding that. We'll also sort of touch on social investment and local investment to drive economies and pull communities together. And then finally finish with just a brief look at supply chains with some of the challenges that have emerged over recent times in particular. I guess all of us, and particularly those in more remote parts of Australia, but even in some of the areas even closer to major cities, in some instances, have struggled with internet access. Traditionally, we've had a real issue with, just getting the message across and for people actually understanding the need. And it's without any doubt that the lockdowns and the impact of the COVID pandemic has really demonstrated the need as people sought to work from home and had various levels of success in that. We saw, obviously, in addition to people working from home, that also included schools. So the loads on our system were significant, and we actually got to the point where some service providers, by agreement with the government, they actually reduced the densities of data transmission, even in streaming of Netflix, etc., just to help relieve the load on the national broadband network. So really, we've got a network in the system that was initially created to be all fibre, and it's still a lot of copper in there, and also a broad expanse of fixed wireless and satellite. And so we've got a system which, from when it began in the 1890s, it was, it was a service obligation. Everyone had to have access to the copper in those days. We've now moved to more of a commercial style model where there are many people in our communities that miss out. One of the things, particularly in regional areas, is that what has happened is that communities have really had to learn to develop, in many instances, because of the restrictions. They've had to develop without the digital, angle to many businesses and community events, because just the lack of it. So we're seeing, obviously, a move with government to go into the digital space themselves, and of course all their services are moving online, and we all know the many businesses doing the same in the cities, the major providers. So if you don't get an internet service and you can't use it regularly, you're actually missing out on a lot of activities and also connectedness to your community and to the greater world. So you know, there's a big push on now, and we understand that NBN have recently upgraded their system, or at least they've put some money into it with the federal government. But we're really looking at a very small group of communities, up to 100 nodes that have fibre. So we're struggling there as well. So part of the push of SEGRA is to get this need out to the various levels of government and get the support and promotion to increase the availability of fibre to more and more communities. And by that, we don't just mean 100, we mean, you know, thousands and thousands of communities. They need access to fibre. So that'll be our push. The other really important thing in there that's restricting us at the moment is that we're not able to get investment without it being having a return of at least 7%, you know, from NBNCO's government requirements. So what we're seeing is that is, again, taking out of the picture a lot of upgrades. So this is an issue that we really need to address as a region, from within our own regions, to push with government to get rid of this 7%, a real hold up to progress. Just one little note, something that has come about that's a lot of you probably heard about Elon Musk and SpaceX's foray into internet. Starlink is their service, a series of low orbit satellites, small satellites, and that service is now available in Australia. It's not as cheap as a commercial service, but that Starlink service does provide a better alternative if it's available to you than the current high orbiting geostationary satellites. So that the latency or the time difference in transmission is a lot lower because it's very low orbit satellite. So there's a lot of issues. We need to develop our regional capacity and obviously training, and that's sort of an overview of what SEGRA will be pursuing in coming weeks and months and at this year's conference. The other issue that around the investment is what regions can do to stimulate investment, and I guess there's a whole lot of capacity building involved in it by utilising either business angels or looking at cooperative investment within the town. You may have heard a number of examples. We started off looking at places around the world, and now in Australia there's a lot of communities out there that have started to band together to really drive, I guess in some instances, town centres which have been dying and services have been dropping out. And so they've banded together. A really good example, and if you ever get the chance to visit Sea Lake up in northwest Victoria, up in the Mallee, they in recent years have had a fabulous example of what can be achieved. One of the particular farmers up there who's also involved in the local football team, a coach, always involved in affairs of the town, pulled together a group of individuals to rescue their local pub. At the time, there were two in town. One had burnt down and one had just closed. So with a group of 43 people, they put together a board. They all invested in it, bought the pub. The local tradesmen revisit repair the site and get it back up to its former glory. There was a huge buy-in with the locals, and I was up there just before COVID hit.
Okay,
and
you're not
trading the stocks off. It was one of those real success stories, but it was driven because of the local ownership. It was any dividends went back. It was back to the local people, kept money in the town, and it certainly became a focal meeting point and very successful enterprise. This was later extended to the hardware store in town as well, with a group of 6 people buying that because that was on its last legs and about to close. So, you know, there's just 2 examples, and I know that they've got more on the way. So if anyone's out there and they'd like to learn a little bit more about the Sea Lake story, we'd be happy to help. And that's some work that the ABC did around that as well. So you can find that information through the ABC news sites. So that was an example of local communities taking it up the challenge for themselves. The next and last item I'd just like to run through briefly was supply chains. Now, we've always known, even before, I guess, COVID, that we rely a lot on overseas suppliers, and obviously shipping, transport, etc., to get our products into production. And one of the issues that we first came across was the issue with China, where there was bans on imports and exports, and so we, particularly exports from here, so a lot of suppliers were getting caught out and with things left on docks. And then, of course, COVID hit, and it was difficult getting products in, and the list of overseas imported products really put a lot of stress on all our manufacturing systems, and also the availability and ability to carry out your normal business. We've seen that of late, particularly with the building industry, with a lot of timbers are imported into Australia, and so we've struggled with that as well. So one of the things that, in regions, of course, they're at the end of the line. So one of the things we need to look at, as with the cities, is that what we actually do to, I guess, put some integrity into our supply systems. And I think we need to look generally at our supply chains, where it's coming from, where our suppliers are getting their supplies, and to put some really good, strong work into looking at supply chains. This was also a subject of discussion and a paper at the last SEGRA conference. So I think we need to have a national conversation around supply chains. We've seen to this point that it's across a range. Even fuel, we're down, we have a 30-day supply. Transport, we're the last at the end of the line to get a ship. And even some agricultural supplies are imported into this country. So it's really something that every business within the regions needs to go back, look, what do they need? How can they future-proof it to the best of their ability? And then comes our national conversation, and this is where, through SEGRA, we'll look to drive with the state and federal governments, is where seeking their support on ensuring these supply chains are improved, and where they need assistance, that the governments put their hand up and actually lead the way and show some leadership in helping to develop the industries, and perhaps import replacement programs and manufacturing to ensure that we can put some integrity back into our supply chain. So it's a major issue. It's been raised, as I said before, at SEGRA, and we have discussed it. But this will be another angle of economic development that we'd like to look at in moving forward. So thank you for listening to that, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the program.
Yeah, thank you, Rod. And as I said, there are a million topics we can talk about, but we've tried to pick the key issues in each stream that we think are important. I'm going to throw to Ashley now. Welcome, Ashley. Ashley's an engineer with a huge background in environmental issues and practical responses, real responses to environmental issues through perhaps a bit of an engineering lens. Thank you, Ash. Ash, if I could just invite you to talk about some of the key environmental issues in regional, rural and remote Australia, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. It's great to be here. I'm coming from Broken Hill today, which is a lovely part of the world to be in. Yeah, look, I was thinking about this quite a lot, and I think we can probably typify what's happening in the environment space now as saying the chickens have come home to roost. Which is that for many decades now, I think we've been able to get away with ignoring what economists refer to as externalities, and make some pretty bold assumptions around business as usual, and the fact that we could keep on with, I guess, operating the way we've always operated in the past. And what I mean by that is really that you know, it doesn't matter where you look now. Water is a really obvious one where it's like, oh, the town's running out of water. Well, let's just get more water. You know, that was okay in the 50s and even into the 80s, and it was cheap enough to build a new dam or sink another bore. And now we've gone, well, actually, water is a contested resource. You can't just get more of it. You know, we've hit up against the limits of sort of population. We've certainly hit up against the environmental sustainability limits of water. And it feels like that everywhere to me. So in terms of land availability, it was always plenty of land, or you could knock some more trees down or whatever. Well, no, you can't do that anymore. Land's contested. Waste, we can just bury a hole and stick it. Well, no, we can't. We're running out of landfill sites, you know. Oh, it doesn't matter, we'll send it to China. Well, no, actually, we can't. You know, and in many extents, you know, having sort of trained in engineering and ecology nearly 30 years ago now, you know, I've long looked at, I guess, the unsustainability of our current systems, but it's just now it's really being pointed out to us. So case in point in Broken Hill, you know, where you know, if you sat down now and said, rightio, how are we going to supply power to Broken Hill? You probably wouldn't say, I know, let's dig coal up in the Hunter Valley, burn it, chuck 2/3 of the energy up the smokestack, then stick it in big power lines, which we've built to get it to the other end of the state, 1,000 kilometres away. You wouldn't do that. Now you would say, well, hang on, why don't we just use the abundant renewable energy that is in Broken Hill and supply Broken Hill with that? And so I think, you know, we in the regions have a challenge in front of us, which is to kind of break that old paradigm of thinking and break the inertia before it breaks for us in the things that we're seeing now, like supply chains. The good news is that I think a lot of the solutions to the problems we're facing in regions already exist, and they're actually pointing in the right direction. Agricultural inputs are a good example of that, where, you know, we're at the mercy of oil prices overseas, gas availability, urea, you know, which has been coming from Eastern Europe and Russia, and of course we know those issues there now. Well, actually, you know, we have the ability to make that out of renewable energy locally. Yeah, we can make urea with a piece of kit that, you know, hooks up to a solar panel. Like, the technology's there now. And so we can start to look at regionalising those supply chains again, which makes sense on, you know, sort of a security point of view, but also, of course, economically. And, you know, with my background in renewable energy, particularly for agribusiness and local government, is that what you're actually addressing is a socio-economic shift there, and you know, doing what actually makes sense, which is creating the energy where you use it, and closing some of these loops that have that we've just come to expect. You know, when you think about it, you know, when I was little, if you went into the shop for a part for your bicycle or whatever it was, and they would check out back to see whether it was there. And we got used to going, oh, it doesn't matter, we'll just ship it in from overseas, you know, it'll be here in 2 days. Like, is that really sensible? And, you know, was that the smart thing to do at the end of an era of, I guess, you know, economic rationalism, where the lowest price to the end consumer was the main driver of our policy of the country? We have to sort of now face up to a few consequences of that, which is that actually we're a bit vulnerable and a bit unsustainable as a result of that. But as I say, the good news from my perspective is that we have a range of solutions at our disposal to, I guess, recreate ecosystems of supply in regional areas. And a lot of that is underpinned by the capacity to create ubiquitous, affordable energy. And we as regions need to start asking ourselves, well, what would we do? You know, what would we do with that energy if we were able to make it locally? How could we use that? And agriculture is one of those. Creating agricultural inputs is you know, a really useful thing to do. There are, of course, a range of micro-industrial applications, the emergence of 3D printing. You know, those sorts of models, I think, are now opening up to us. And guess what? It's, you know, it's addressing the economic leakage that happens from when we've brought everything into our region. as well. You know, where I live in Central West New South Wales, you know, we spend about $1 billion a year on energy in that region alone. And I often say, if the local member stood up and said, all right, people of this region, we're going to give you 100 million a year to let wash through your economy, you know, do whatever you like with it, you know, we'd say the Messiah had arrived. And, you know, that's just 10% of that opportunity in terms of energy. You know, so we really are on the cusp of fueling our vehicles locally, running our tractors, that industry turnaround that can occur with energy, and which can also then address some of these other issues we've got around water and waste and landscape management. Is that enough of there's a bit of a blast for you, Kate. I think you're on mute, Kate.
Thanks, Ash, and I'll just do a bit of a plug here in terms of water. Ash and a couple of other people from SEGRA set up a SEGRA challenge 7 years ago on how do we provide safe and secure water to off-grid communities in regional, rural and remote Australia. And over the last 5 years, we've developed a number of programs from the Murray-Darling Basin in southwest Darling Downs, Etheridge Shire, Balranald Shire, helping those communities identify ways in which they can act to improve the quality and quantity of water that they have access to in regional Australia. We had a webinar on that last week, and there's going to be some publications of that work. So keep an eye out for that. And also, if I could say hello to Matt, good to hear from you. Matt's in the chat box has talked about some work at Yakandanda on community investment. And if you scroll down, he's got a link there to an article. So thanks, Matt, for providing that. Because we're going on themes rather than a broad discussion, I would now like to invite Rolf to speak. Rolf is in Charles Darwin University and has been very involved in the work to do with the development of the Northern Territory. And this has been an exciting time to be looking at some new models, some new perspectives and some new approaches. So if I could hand over to you, Rolf, and thanks for joining us because I know you're not well. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. I'm afraid I'm going to disabuse you. There aren't that many new models around. What I want to do is just have a quick chat about northern development. Now, this is a periodic fashion. Luckily, I'm old and I can remember 3 distinct phases of northern development in my lifetime. The first was in the 50s and was driven largely by the Commonwealth, and it was a subsidiary element of the post-war feeling that we had to populate Australia. You know, otherwise we would lose it. And so the idea was that the north had to be populated as well, and the model, if you like, was agricultural development. And so we grew rice to feed magpie geese, and we did lots of other silly things in the north. And I suppose that phase ended with the Ord River scheme, which is one of the largest and silliest schemes ever done in Australia. And the successive West Australian Auditor Generals have lamented the waste of public money on that scheme. Incidentally, the Ord River scheme even now produces less agricultural value than the Darwin rural horticulture zone that costs the government nothing. So, you know, the models are confused. But anyway, the second phase of northern development was in the early 1970s, essentially driven by the Whitlam government. Well, that was derailed by Cyclone Tracy, so all the money went into rebuilding Darwin. And then currently in around about 2014-15, it suddenly became an issue again. And of course, it's always an election issue. I mean, I don't know if you noticed, but yesterday the Prime Minister promised to build a dam at Hell's Gate on the Burdekin River. This is going to have a fairly low wall, so it'll be a gigantic area, very shallow, so will be contributing to global moisture. So, you know, there are lots of silly schemes, but I don't want to dwell on those. The current Northern Australian Development Agenda, which is still pottering along actually, and has, I think, exhibited more resilience than previous ones because it's been institutionalised, and essentially institutionalised in the Office of Northern Australia, which historically offices of Northern Australia have been associated with Labor governments, but this time it's a Conservative government that's running it. And also the North Australia Infrastructure Facility, which is back in 2015, the federal government tipped $5 billion into that, and they've recently added another $2 or $3 billion, and I want to discuss some of the projects under that. The North Australia Infrastructure Facility claims or states that it operates on business-like principles, and it's only interested in business-type or commercially ready proposals, and it's invested in some projects that are reasonable. I can think of the expansion of the Dampier port to allow more iron ore to be exported. God knows to whom, perhaps to China, perhaps to Russia, who knows. But you know, it's because of the business focus, it has a very narrow ambit in the way that it evaluates projects. For example, it gave money to, I can't remember the name of it, Perdine's urea plant, which is going to impinge on the Burrup Peninsula, which is a very important Indigenous rock art site. So there's very little concern for the environment more broadly. So the current agenda is a very, if you like, traditional, in inverted commas, economic development agenda for Northern Australia. So the idea is to increase the population of Northern Australia. The original Green Paper back in 2014 actually proposed that the target should be 5 million people. Well, now we have problems with water supply to Cairns and Darwin now. If we doubled or tripled the size of those cities, I mean, I don't know what the people would do, but we would have very great water supply problems. And so your earlier point about water supply is very important in the north. I mean, some people seem to think that there's lots of these big rivers and there's lots of water running, but it's very, very seasonal, and you're dealing with very fragile ecosystems. The economic development framework that is being administered currently is basically about supply chains and transport and market development. So there's a heavy emphasis on infrastructure, and I want to deal with two projects that the North Australia Infrastructure Facility has funded in the Northern Territory. I mentioned two in Western Australia. They've been very slow in rolling the money out of the gate, so I think they've still got about $3 billion of the original $5 billion left. So these two projects in the Northern Territory are, firstly, a investment or a grant of 80 million to a barramundi farm. Now, this is the largest barramundi farm in Australia. It produces something like 10 or 12% of the farmed barramundi in the country. It's generally relatively sustainable. It's on the Adelaide River. As a business, very efficient. They've got rid of downstream supply issues and technology supply issues by producing their own. So they raise the barramundi from fingerlings right through to farm barramundi that goes to the market, and they've developed very high scientific capacity. So you could say that's a good project. The second project is one that my university is involved in, and it is a bad project. my university, the previous Vice-Chancellor fancied himself as a bit of a player in Northern Territory politics. And so when the Territory government was chasing NAIF money for sort of urban development, because the urban shopkeepers are complaining about the economy, they got some money from Better Cities. The university got some money from, or loaned 150 million from NAIF to build a very large posh building in the CBD. Now, the main campus of the university is in the suburban area where most of the people in Darwin live. But they built a posh campus. Now, the CDU is not the only university to build posh campuses in the CBD. Edith Cowan in WA is doing it, and I think one of the Sydney universities is doing it. So the $400 million building, the university that doesn't have very many students and is not likely to get very many more because of geographical considerations and distance from population. But NAIF has cheerfully chucked $150 million into that project, which will leave that Australia's smallest university with this debt hanging over its neck for several vice-chancellors to come, I suspect. So the current Northern Development agenda is, I would argue, a very traditional one, economic development, rich in traditional patterns, that is more agriculture. Unfortunately, the image in the mind of the official policymakers is agriculture equals broadacre cropping. And broadacre cropping then requires irrigation. The heavy emphasis is on the Burdekin Valley, and the Burdekin will end up, I suspect, comprehensively ruined and be the subject of my grandchildren to fix up. I mean, there is a place for agriculture in Northern Australia. I mean, the success of the horticultural region in the hinterland of Darwin is an example, but it's very spotty. I mean, the coincidence between the supply of water and good soil is limited. So you've got little spots of good soil that is near enough to water to make them useful. But the government appears to be developing on behalf of large corporations rather than individual farmers, and farmers who are conscious of their environment and will work with it rather than against it. So the other failure, I think, in the current Northern Development agenda is the way that Indigenous interests are incorporated. And again, this is a very traditional focus. NAIF and the Office of Northern Australia both say they want to fund and encourage Indigenous businesses. The Office of Northern Australia actually admits the existence of the Indigenous carbon farming industry. Now, that's started in the early years of this century in Western Arnhem Land and has spread across Northern Australia. There are about 50 projects now. 2 years ago, which is the last set of figures that I can get, it earned $90 million in carbon credits. This is a big industry potentially. I think it's at about 20% of potential capacity. Excuse me. I've got a rather heavy cold. So, you know, what we need in the north is not, if you like, 1950s type developments. We need to look at the land and the environment and the water and work with it rather than against it. And I think Indigenous carbon burning, which manages the country, it's become nationally fashionable since the East Coast bushfires 2 years ago, is a way of capturing carbon, which is a market that is both profitable and environmentally friendly. So at that stage, at this stage, I think there's not going to be much new thinking without a change of government in terms of how we deal with Northern Development, or even if this artificial construct we call Northern Australia needs to be developed. So that, I think that's all. Kate, is that enough?
Unmute.
Can't hear you, Kate.
Thank you very much, Rolf. And I guess I could just pull a few things together there in terms of the way I think about regional Australia. And I'm very keen on regional Australia being on the national policy agenda. One of the things Jen Cleary always says is, if you've seen one region, you've seen one region. And I think what you've highlighted there is that regions are very dynamic ecosystems, and there's resources and there's people and there's the environment, there's infrastructure. And the other thing that we talk about a lot is identifying what is the investable business case. So what's the business case that will actually get a return? So that's just a bit of a summary of some of the things that come to my mind when you speak of that. You did bring up the role of Indigenous economic development and the well-being of Indigenous people, and it gives me much pleasure to invite Jodie, who's on the National Steering Committee from Queensland, to talk a little bit about Indigenous issues as they relate to regional Australia. So welcome, Jodie, and over to you.
Thanks, Kate. Yep, look, Garbaninda, Yama Malia, Dagan Jodie, Gomeroi Gamillaroi. I'm currently on country, and I just want to acknowledge my elders, past, present and emerging, all over Australia, as well as here in my country, and also acknowledge our young people who obviously are learning to fly as we speak. What I've heard so far is, picks up on a lot of the issues that I've put on the table today, and I guess I'm an advocate for regional leadership, and hence, my application to SEGRA, and obviously, my position with SEGRA to advocate for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across the country. I do work nationally, and so I have seen, these types of issues that I'm going to talk about as being important issues. And I guess the first one is regional leadership. And I think if we're going to get any progress across all of our regions, we need to present a seat at the table, because for far too long, policies have been made for us and not with us. And I think we've got an emerging, from the ABS figures, we've got an emerging silent, increase in a middle class Indigenous people coming through. And these are people that are reaching, high levels of employment, and therefore are serious participants, I guess, in the economy. Now, we can't have, representation in the different industries if we don't have leadership. And the only way to increase leadership, to be able to get or reach diversity, as well as providing a 360-degree view, is to provide a seat at the table for the right representative of our people. Rolf's touched on, our environmentalists and the millennium age practices that our people, have provided and continue to provide. We've got people studying the stars, so we have our own astronomers. We've also got people represented in the high levels of medical, as well as other industries. And so we've got a lot of people coming through universities with the qualifications to not only be representative in each of those industries, but also leading the way and being role models, for our people at grassroots. And so, by providing regional leadership, we're modelling the way, and we're also providing an inclusive representation. Now, some of the long-standing issues that are still prominent in our communities includes health, and these are just a few of the closing the gap targets that are still, have a long way to go. We've got physical and mental health impediments, we've got chronic diseases, and our people, it's okay to say, come on, you guys, let's, apply for these jobs. But we've got these types of social issues that, like a catch-22. We've got our Aboriginal medical services, you know, that are doing a fine job. But I think, you know, without the resources that are needed, and especially in remote Australia, where geography is a challenge, accessing specialists, not being able to attract specialist staff like doctors and nurses, or being able to keep those doctors and nurses because of the social issues that are happening in communities. Housing is another one. We still have overcrowding. We've got issues around affordability, and also the design of housing. I'm currently working on a housing project here on country, and what I've found is that, you know, and this has a flow-on effect to some of the other issues that I'm going to talk about. In the private market, we're seeing racism and unconscious and conscious bias to the point where our people are being excluded. Now, we're talking about people who can afford private rentals as well as, you know, be potential homeowners themselves. And I guess the spirit of social housing is that tenants be entitled to receive a good experience, so that as housing providers, providing a whole of service to those tenants, you know, dissecting, you know, what's happening for that person, you know, within their, you know, their private life, as well as, you know, them as tenants being able to afford and keep to the tenancy agreements. And then come out the other side and live the Australian dream of home ownership. And unfortunately, we've got those sorts of pediments where, you know, the tenant is only looked upon, you know, in terms of meeting their tenancy agreement. Unemployment is still, you know, high on the agenda, and I guess it comes back to regional leadership. If we're looking at investment attraction across the regions, we also need to be considering First Nation people within, you know, any projects, any investments. Talk about employment strategies as well. We have a number of different employment agencies that not only have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff that work within those entities, whether they be job networks, the Aboriginal Employment Strategy, which has a national reach, or whether it's dealing with NIAA, who have, you know, obviously a link to, and Department of Employment, linked to employment specialists and people on the ground, you know. Moving to, you know, I guess mentoring as well is a secret, you know, to any employment strategy involving our people. And we're still playing catch up in this area, even though we're, you know, we're represented. If you have a look at the statistics, workforce statistics, you'll find that there's not a lot of us represented at the senior management levels. And we need to be able to, I guess, move people through those career paths so they can come up into those policy areas in order to provide an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander jurisdiction. And I would say that would radiate throughout all the regions with everything that we do, is that we get a First Nation view, we get a First Nation position, and we also get a First Nation self-analysis of readiness to participate, or at least, you know, come to some arrangement to track towards being represented. Moving into racism as well, as I mentioned, there's unconscious and conscious bias. There's a lot of assumptions and stereotyping out there that we still have a long way to go to break down those barriers. And unless we address it, you know, we're never going to achieve access and equity in its true spirit. I love the new Qantas ad at the moment that's showing and being televised, because, you know, it does emulate an Australian spirit where we can all be, you know, all come together as one. Institutionalised racism today is being normalised in the workforce and in workplaces, and it does normalise workplace cultures. And I've been involved in mediations, I've been involved in mentoring, I've been involved in healing programs for staff, and it is evident in most industries. And I guess one of the industries that shines, which has come out of the 1980s policies around inclusion and self-determination, has been the cultural tourism. And I think, Rolf, you would have seen that in the north. Ash, I'm sure there's some Western examples out Broken Hill way as well, and Shani over in Broome, your way. Certainly some good examples there, but there is still a lot of hidden pockets where you've got cultural centres that provide tour guides and also, you know, bush tucker experiences and things like that. But even to gain the local story to local communities, where a lot of people have grown up with people and never knew that they either identified, let alone what the creation story and who the traditional owners are of that area. Education is another big one. You know, finding the right support to encourage people to stay on at school is key. Forever in a day, our people have been asking for First Nations culture to be included in curriculum. And unfortunately, it comes down to the attitude and the support from principals and into regional education, and as to whether it's supported or not. There used to be programs around to encourage parents to be involved in schools. That doesn't exist. All we have is P&Cs that are typically managed by dominant culture today, and we still have you know, bad experiences of parents where, you know, their schooling was of a bad experience, and, you know, and therefore they've passed that experience on to their kids, which is, it should be reversed, it should be addressed, and, you know, I think principals should be more encouraging. Coming to my last point around recognition and reconciliation, I want to bring to the fore the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Now, this was a statement that I guess could be looked on as a log of claims, you know, for our people to the Australians of this country, and especially for the government, you know, to receive this. It was produced in or created in 2017, where our mob gathered at Uluru and put together Voice, Makarrata, which is an Aboriginal word for treaty, and truth. And they're the three key elements which reflect the aspirations and the reforms that our people would like to see in this country on both parties. And I think if you have a really good look at that Uluru Statement from the Heart, you'll be able to see the spirit of the message that is trying to be sent to the Australian people. So I just want to leave it there. I am available for any questions or follow-up after today. So by all means, reach out through Kate and I'll be happy to connect. Thanks, Kate. Gabaninda, thank you.
Thank you, Jody. And look, one of the things that I've found inspirational about your presentation then is raising important issues that need to be addressed. But I probably noted down 15 ideas that anyone anywhere could implement now to make a difference, and I think that's fabulous. I'd really hoped to invite Devon Kumara to speak now, which is a bit off script, but Devon is the CEO of the Aboriginal Males Healing Centre, Strong Spirit, Strong Families, Strong Culture, Inc. And his website is in our chat group. And I think the thing that's exciting about that is that it's an Aboriginal community controlled organisation providing culturally authentic family violence services to Aboriginal men. It's in the Shire of East Pilbara, Western Australia. incorporated in 2015 and began working in 2018. And their vision is that all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and children live safe and healthy lives, free of family violence and homelessness. And in addition, our mission is to reduce the overrepresentation of First Nations men incarcerated for their use of violence. And it's great to see an Aboriginal community-controlled organisation in regional Australia, being East Pilbara, doing this sort of work. So congratulations, Devon, and we might be in touch with you outside of this to see if we can't highlight that program. And one of the things to say to people is that the call for papers for SEGRA will be out shortly, and the National Steering Committee is always looking for successful case studies, so things that people are doing in the regions that other people can replicate. And one of the feedbacks we get from SEGRA is, I got so many ideas at the conference. The very last area, and we've got 4 minutes instead of 6 minutes, but the very last area that we wanted to talk about was in the space of social capability and community well-being. And we've already addressed a little bit the issues of community well-being. The thing that came up the most in our discussions about that was improved access to health, allied health services and education. Rod's already touched on the fact that so much of that is dependent on digital connectivity, so that there are lots of options there. But if we don't have connectivity, we can't use them, and there are equity issues. So as we saw in COVID, a lot of families don't have computers. They certainly don't have a computer per child. They certainly can't afford to pay for internet in advance. So they're on the pay-as-you-go, which is more expensive. And so there are a whole range of issues to do with connectivity that have to be addressed in order to deliver some of the tremendous opportunities that are available in health and education. The other thing, though, that we were very conscious of in that space is that this isn't a replacement, it's an augmentation. And that just as in the olden days, we used to think a 1-800 number was a regional service, the internet is not a regional service in the absence of specialisation. And so that needed to be talked about. The other issue that came up very strongly at last year's conference, and it's been an issue for a long time that we wanted to put on the agenda at this meeting, is the thin workforce. And that in many, many regions, people could work if there was childcare and flexible childcare because of shift working in mines and things like that. So they were the couple of things that we particularly had in community wellbeing, as well as in providing the opportunity for not-for-profit organisations and those community-based organisations to get governance skills training. And we promoted a webinar that the Governance Institute of Australia was running on exactly this topic, but with the shift to locally based decision-making and increasing expectations of communities to lead things, that we really need to get our governance and our governance for multi-agency projects a bit more in place. So that was really around the well-being. We had some other things around social capacity, and some of those things were population, which has already been mentioned, and housing. And I'm going to hand over now to Shani, who works in Broome, but prior to that worked in the city of Kalgoorlie-Boulder. And so certainly talk about housing, but if you'd like to bring in some stuff about population change as well, that would be great. So welcome, Shani.
Thanks, Kate. Good morning, everyone. I'm coming to you today from beautiful Kununurra, actually. So right up the top in WA's top end. And as Rod mentioned earlier, the availability of connectivity is a very important topic and a very real topic for me this morning. My hotel doesn't have Wi-Fi and my phone's only operating on 3G at the moment. So I've had to reconnect 3 times so far to attend our webinar this morning. So here's hoping my connection holds up for the next couple of minutes. Housing has been identified as a key issue in terms of housing availability and affordability across all of regional WA and Australia. So it's absolutely exacerbated the skill shortage, and it's accelerated the division between the haves and have-nots. For example, Bathurst and Orange have seen extraordinary increases in home values and rent, which has effectively squeezed young people out of their first homeowners market. 62% of homes in Orange house 1 or 2 people. On the other side of the country, over in the west, the average weekly rent in Broome is $830 a week for a 3-bedroom house. So housing availability affects all of us. It affects those on welfare with government housing, whereas Jody mentioned earlier, overcrowding is on the rise more often than not in regional areas. Our First Nations people are sharing a 3 to 4 bedroom home with 14 or 15 people and multiple families. And this has a much bigger impact than just housing. It affects our children and our youth with truancy and being able to focus at school. Business owners report that they can't employ people from the city because they can't find them somewhere to live. As Kate mentioned, I was previously in Kalgoorlie and I relocated up to Broome at the end of last year. We put in 2 or 3 offers on properties. 2 or 3 of them fell through because of the volatile market. They're extremely challenging to get finance. We lived in a share house. I haven't lived in a share house for 10 years with 4 other young people, and it's been an experience, but it's an experience that was widely common among the northern rural community. In saying that, we still paid $350 a week for a room. So added to this, the difficulties of COVID. In WA at the moment, if someone in your household has COVID, you are to all isolate for 7 days. So you can imagine if it's a week and a week and a week, and potentially the first person that got it was isolating for 4 weeks. You've got your border closures and entry requirements with go-to-go passes requiring a residential address, combined with an ageing demographic in the regions that are increasingly feeling the impact of fewer people coming up through the ranks and fewer people coming into Australia to work. Housing is an issue that is affecting all of regional Australia across all sectors, from teachers to mechanics to healthcare and medical professionals. It's really hard to find someone, and it's always harder to find them somewhere to live. So as we saw at the last SEGRA conference, innovation around addressing housing supply was a very popular topic. The winning group of our Super Pitch event was proposing the idea of 3D printing houses down in the Shire of Norseman. It's a very probable opportunity, and it's something that I think we need to look into. So there is a lot to be done in this space with new development, and I'll leave you on my final closing note, and that's that every Australian deserves to have somewhere safe to call home.
Thanks, Shani. We're 3 minutes over time, so I will have to wrap up. As everyone knows, when the National Steering Committee gets together, we can talk for hours on these topics. And so we have actually been very disciplined today to just try and stick to a few key topics rather than going down the many and varied interests. Thank you all very much for joining us today. It's been great to have so many people. The video has been recorded and will be on the website shortly, and I will hope to write a paper that reflects these particular key issues. And as I said, if I can encourage you to read the communiques that the National Steering Committee puts out as occasional papers during the year, that would be excellent. Thank you to everyone who is attending, who lives and works in regional Australia, and no doubt feels as passionate about regional Australia as we do. Thank you all very much.